Alright folks, how's it going? Cams Campbell here, your host for the conclusion of Dr. Zhivago. So, first of all, let's celebrate my new mug. New to me, got it off eBay because the high horse one broke. I glued it together, it didn't stay glued together. So I got this one. So, to the seller on eBay who packaged this so exquisitely, thank you for doing such a good job with that. Right. Coffee is on the go, and the conclusion. So this will be going out as usual on my Substack over at camscampbellreads.substack.com, where there'll be an essay and some images as well to accompany the essay, and also a downloadable PDF which you can print at your leisure, take it away to the park or the beach, read it there, whatever you want to do, and of course YouTube video and audio podcast. Right, so there we go. This is a conclusion. Next week we've got the epilogue and then the poems. So we're nearly done. And the conclusion's quite long, so buckle in. So here's what I've written. Yury is in Moscow at the beginning of the new economic policy. Lenin announced the NEP in March 1921, and it ran until 1928. Pasternak calls it the most false and ambiguous of all Soviet periods. And I can see his point. Under war communism, all trade was forbidden. The NEP restored limited legal private trade. Yury has gone to seed, no longer working as a doctor and writing only between bouts of depression. His congenital heart condition worsens during this period. He looks even worse than he did when he arrived in Reunited after escaping from the partisans. He inquires of those whom he still knows in Moscow about the circumstances of his family's departure from Russia. Pasternak tells us that Yury did not arrive in Moscow alone. A boy in rags has followed him, and they now avoid people together as much as they can. A man after my own heart. Yury made the last part of his journey to Moscow by train, but before that he had walked for most of it. The going was easier in summer, but many of the towns and villages he passed through were abandoned after the war. Yury comes to a deserted village on the bank of a river. As he sits on a millstone, a teenage boy comes up the cliff path carrying a bucket of water. You just know from Pasternak's style that this is going to be another of those coincidences that season the plot. It is indeed Vasya Brykin, the young recruit we met in Chapter 7, who had been tricked into conscription by his aunt and uncle. He and Yury were on the same train to the Urals. The deserted village is Veretenniki, Vasya's home village. Vasya had been asked to help out with the potato harvest, after which the widow asked him to come back and help her hide the surplus from the requisition detachments. This he does, but after a month the house is robbed and the widow is found buried where the potato surplus was buried. It's a bit of a shaggy dog story. Its purpose, I think, is to illustrate what war communism did to the citizens, turning good people into criminals and inciting class warfare with the anti-kulak campaign. Stalin doubled down on that in a big way later on when the kulaks were wiped out as a class. Yury encourages Vasya to continue drawing. It seems that mentoring this young man is doing wonders for Yury. He's writing booklets on various subjects, and Vasya is illustrating and binding them as part of his work at the Institute, where he's now studying bookbinding, design and printing. Under the NEP, Yury can now sell them through the second-hand bookshops. In her essay published in Dr. Zhivago, A Critical Companion, Carol J. Avans discusses Yury's access to the reading public. This moment marks what Avans calls the second reception. In other words, the second time Yury's publications have reached a reading audience. The first time was back in 1917 when his two friends, Misha Gordon and Nicky Dudarov, published a book of Yury's poetry without his knowledge. What's interesting here is that the Yury of 1917 had no interest in finding readers for his poetry, whereas the Yury of 1922 most certainly does. I'll return to this in part 6. Yury and Vasya's friendship soon deteriorates as Vasya becomes more self-confident and embraces the revolution, while Yury continues in his usual way. The two men part company and Yury takes up residence in the corner of a room in what had once been the Sventitsky's flat, the one in which Lara shot Komarovsky. Yury fetches water while his landlord Markel and family are eating dinner. Markel was the yard porter who helped build Anna Ivanovna's ebony wardrobe in Chapter 3. He'd brought his daughter Marina with him at the time. That was in 1911. She was aged 6. Markel has moved up in the world since the revolution and is now the house manager. As Yury repeatedly interrupts their meal to fetch more water, Markel gets annoyed with him, but Marina sticks up for him. And within a few paragraphs, Yury and Marina are now living together as a couple and have children. Pasternak doesn't waste any time. Within a few sentences, we learn that Marina is now helping Yury with odd jobs around town, including chopping firewood for a particular client who, Yury discovers, just happens to be reading one of Yury's booklets. Avans discusses this in the light of the establishment reader. Yury's distaste for this man, who is reading Yury's work and making pencil marks in the margin, arises from this emblem of the late 1920s. The establishment reader, a would-be arbiter of literary and ideological standards. What could she mean by this? That the reader reads not to enliven his soul with art, self-improvement or education, but merely to evaluate it against the backdrop of accepted ideology. My mind goes back to reading about some of Pasternak's sold-out poetry reading nights in theatres, or the invitation-only events he held where he would read passages from Dr. Zhivago. The audience here was hungry for his art, but he was writing against the backdrop of the Union of Soviet Writers, a union from which Pasternak was eventually expelled in 1958 when Alexei Surkov was the union's general secretary. It's fair to say that Surkov was reading to evaluate for ideological purposes. So what Avans has to say about this scene makes perfect sense to me. Translation points. There are a few interesting points of translation in this section. The first translation in each example is from Hayward and Harari, and the second is from Pevear and Volokhonsky. First of all, I'd never seen this Russian variant of Bon Appetit. It translates literally as bread and salt. First translation, a good appetite. Second translation, enjoy your meal. And the Russian, chlyeb da sol. This next one is interesting. Markel is using a pun here. First translation, I'd lock the door for 2 pins. Second translation, what a noble Freemason you are. And the Russian, Какой ты благородный каменщик. The word каменщик means bricklayer or mason, so Pevear and Volokhonsky's Freemason seems unusual. There is a trail to follow though. The Russian for Freemason is вольный каменщик, literally Freemason, borrowed from the English. Markel doesn't quite say that. He says благородный каменщик, noble mason. So one reading is that he's punning on the familiar expression, swapping one lofty adjective for another, and that a Russian ear catches the echo, in which case Pevear and Volokhonsky have simply made the joke explicit. Although, note that mason in English is often used as shorthand for Freemason, whether noble or otherwise. But there's a plainer reading too. Благородный also means well-born, of the gentry. Markel, a yard porter who's come up in the world since the revolution, is needling a doctor who's come down in it, reduced to hauling his own water. What a gentleman labourer you are! A class sneer, no lodge required. On that reading, P&V's Freemason is a bit of a leap, and Hayward and Harari were wise to abandon the masonry altogether and reach for a homegrown idiom. To do something for 2 pins is an old British expression, meaning you're on the verge of doing it without needing much of an excuse. I'd quit my job right now for 2 pins. It loses the wordplay, but it nails Markel's tone. I genuinely can't decide between the two. Perhaps it's both at once. A class jibe folded into an idiom echo. Are there any native Russian speakers in the comments? Does благородный каменщик wink at вольный каменщик for you? Or is Freemason a bridge too far? I'm curious about Hayward and Harari's use of poor fish in this next phrase. It's not an English idiom I'm familiar with, and the Russian is not an idiom. P and V have used a non-idiomatic phrase, which seems the right choice. First translation. As if I'm to blame that you're a poor fish. Second translation. But is it my fault if you didn't turn out? And the Russian. А не что я тебе повинен, что ты не выдался. This next phrase is somewhat colloquial, and both translators have had fun with it. First translation, you're such a wet hen. Second translation, a sad sack like you. And the Russian, Эх ты, как и серчать на тебя, курицыно отродье. The hen metaphor fits, as the Russian is a contemptuous phrase that literally translates as spawn of a chicken. However, it breaks down in its meaning. Wet hen is typically used to describe someone who's really angry, and that doesn't quite fit the context here. P and V have got closer to the original, as it portrays someone who's a bit pathetic and not worth bothering with. Okay, part 7. It's 1929. Yury and Marina have 2 daughters. Misha Gordon lives nearby. Yury, Nicky Dudarov and Misha Gordon are in conversation. Pasternak is not kind in his description of Nicky and Misha. He describes them as average thinkers with poor vocabulary. I wonder who the models for these characters might have been. So Yury is enlightened while his friends are, if not average, at least towing the line. Quote, men who are not free, Yury thought, always idealise their bondage. Yury speaks out against his friend's views. His heart, he claims, is in danger of bursting because of living a life of duplicity. Quote, your nervous system isn't a fiction. You can't keep violating it with impunity. Nicky and Misha admonish Yury for his ways and implore him to come round to their way of thinking. He refuses and goes on to describe how he's been corresponding with Tonya and her father in Paris. Their 2 children are doing well, and somehow or other they all seem to know about his relationship with Marina and the birth of their 2 daughters. He then leaves, saying that he feels suffocated and needs some air. The following morning, nobody knows where he is. Yury has disappeared and his friends are all out looking for him. Eventually, each of them receives a letter from him imploring them not to worry about him. He's seeking solitude and wants to get his life back in order before returning. He forwards some money so Marina can hire a nurse for the children and go back to work. It turns out that Yury was living with his half-brother Yevgraf in an apartment fewer than 100 yards away from his home with Marina. They'd bumped into one another, whereupon Yevgraf had persuaded Yury to let him help him. He gets Yury a good post at the hospital and gives him money. He assures Yury that the situation with his family will be resolved one way or another, with Yury's either going to them in Paris or they are returning to Moscow. This gives Yury heart, and he does not inquire about the source of Yevgraf's power. Yury is busy working on his projects, a time of devouring activity. His living room was a banqueting room of the spirit, a lumber room of unreason, a storeroom of discoveries. You can almost feel Pasternak here in his study in Pevear Kino. Yury is putting down the snippets of poetry from what he can remember or expanding on the manuscripts that Yevgraf seems somehow to have archived. He's in a fervour with his artistic ideas flowing through him onto the page, and he's not able to write quickly enough to capture them all. Yury is inspired by Moscow. In his writing, he name-checks the poets of the modern city: Alexander Blok, 1880 to 1921, Emil Verhaeren, 1855 to 1916, and Walt Whitman, 1819 to 1892. Yury is writing about Moscow in prose, which is interesting because Pasternak always considered his novel his magnum opus, and his poetry was a means of practicing until he reached the pinnacle of his creativity in prose. It's ironic to me that the word I would use to describe the prose Yury writes here is poetic. Quote, fragmentary personal poems are hardly suited to meditating on such obscure, new and solemn events. Only prose and philosophy can attempt to deal with them. And that's a letter taken from Voices in the Snow, Encounters with Russian Writers. A letter written by Pasternak. Yury takes a tram to start his new job at the hospital at the end of August. The tram keeps breaking down and getting stuck, causing a queue of more trams behind. It's a hot and airless day. The tram car fills up with passengers who have vacated the trams behind it. An old grey-haired lady passes the tram. It's Mademoiselle Fleury. Remember her from Chapter 5, the Swiss woman who had assisted at the hospital in Meluseyevo. The tram overtakes her, then stops again, whereupon Mademoiselle Fleury overtakes the tram. Yury does not recognise her from his past. Instead, he's thinking of mathematical equations to work out distance, time and speed. Quote, he thought of several people whose lives run parallel and close together, but at different speeds, and wondered in what circumstances some of them would overtake and survive others. Something like a theory of relativity applied to a human race course occurred to him. It's that old symphony idea that I've discussed before about lives intersecting and moving at different speeds, starting and stopping at different times. Polyphony and harmony, dissonance, changing rhythms, tempos and time signatures. We as readers get to hear the symphony, knowing as we do that these two characters' lives crossed paths at one point and that they're now in the same scene again, only they don't know. Something breaks inside Yury. His heart is failing him. The tram stops, he gets off and his heart gives out on him. He dies stepping off a tram, just as his father died jumping off a train. Only Yury's tram had stopped where his father's train had not. And so Yury's melody in the symphony stops, but the symphony itself does not. Mademoiselle Fleury continues on her way, not knowing that she knew the man who just died in front of her. Yury is lying in his coffin atop a table in his room in Kamerga Street. Many mourners come to pay their respects, both those who knew him personally and those who knew him only through his writing. The symmetry here is no accident. The novel opened with a funeral, Yury's mother's, and now it closes with his own. In the language of symphony, her funeral is the overture, his is the coda. And it doesn't stand alone. Yury's father fell to his death from a train, while Yury fell dying from a tram. Pasternak has been closing circles all along. And one more is about to close in part 14 in the very flat where Yury's body lies. While mourners file past Yury's body, two unknown mourners stand out. The first is his half-brother Yevgraf. He has arranged everything. Yury is to be cremated that night. The other is Lara. She's come from Irkutsk by coincidence. Yes, another one. The flat where Yury had been staying turns out to be Lara and Pasha Antipov's old flat, the one in which they had lit the candle on the windowsill that Yury saw on his way to the Sventitsky's Christmas party. Yevgraf asks Lara for help sorting out Yury's papers. He tells her that Pasha was not shot, as Lara believed, but that he had shot himself. Not only that, but it had happened at Veretenniki, the last place where she and Yury had lived together. It's coincidence upon coincidence, and yet somehow it all works. Lara herself calls it a preordained coincidence. Quote, never, never, not even in their moments of richest and wildest happiness, had they lost the sense of what is highest and most ravishing, joy in the whole universe, its form, its beauty, the feeling of their own belonging to it, being part of it. I'll take that, thank you very much. This paragraph sums up my belief, but I would take it one step further. It's through art this feeling is communicated. Are not all artists in some way trying to convey this idea of universality? In all times, art is the way. The paragraph that begins with, so here we are again, Yurichka, is just sublime. Life and death, the joy of living, love. It's when one's emotions are at their most raw that one can truly feel the harmony of the universe. It's always there, but we just don't get to see it often. Day-to-day living dulls the connection. The goodbye scene from Lara to Yury is both heartbreaking and life-affirming. She talks with Yury about what she's been through, but doesn't go into detail. We are left to read between the lines based on what she says to Yury and what she'd asked of Yevgraf about finding children who had been given up for adoption. And this is where the lines between the novel and real life become blurred. In Lara, Anna Pasternak describes Olga Ivinskaya as being left alone for half an hour beside Boris Pasternak's body, weeping and thinking, even in that moment, how prophetic Dr. Zhivago had been. Everything had been marked out, stage by stage, in the novel. The words Pasternak gave Lara at Yury's coffin became Olga's, as she said her own goodbye to Boris. He had written their love story through his characters and had even predicted its ending. The novel wasn't quite finished with Olga just yet. Lara tells Yevgraf, quote, an important fact, and then leaves. The narrator tells us that she then disappeared, probably having been arrested and sent to the camps. There's a retrospective resonance here. Olga Ivinskaya had already been incarcerated once during Pasternak's lifetime. She was arrested again after his death. Isn't it chilling? Coincidences in the novel and coincidences in real life. So there we go. Rest in peace, Yury Zhivago. He died a young man, guessing in his 40s. For some reason I've got the number 43 in my head. So a lot younger than Pasternak himself. Pasternak was 70 when he died in 1960. And he would have spent the last 20 years of his life writing Dr. Zhivago. His earlier life was all about the poetry. So did he believe... Yeah, he did. I mean, did Yury believe that prose was higher art than poetry? No, we don't get that feeling. That doesn't come across. Although Yury's writing these booklets and pamphlets on different topics just before the end of his life, and it's a pamphlet that his ideological reader is reading when he goes to deliver the chopped wood. So, I don't know. Pasternak, though, certainly did believe that. I've read that in various different sources, that he looked upon the novel as being a higher art form, at least for him. So, interesting. And for what is he most well known now? Probably Dr. Zhivago. Yeah, I mean, he did win the Nobel Prize for Literature, even though he had to reject it in the end. I believe that was 1958 that he was awarded the prize. So the book was published in 1957 in Italy, not in Russia, and was then secretly smuggled into Russia by the CIA, of all people. You can read all about that in the Zhivago Affair, which is a fascinating read. This one here. The Zhivago Affair by Petra Cuvée and Peter Finn. So, yeah, Yury's dead. Lara's gone, arrested. What's going to be in the epilogue? Curious to see. You can read it with me, of course, and we'll find out next week when the last essay goes out. I'm not sure what to do about the poetry, to be honest. The poetry... Maybe I should do a separate video on that. And yeah, I'll do that. I will. I think you deserve it, my viewers, my readers. Even if I discuss only one or two poems, it's still worth doing, I think. But yeah, I'm going to get into discussion on what I think about translations of poetry. Because that's a thing, you know. We'll get into that later. All right, thanks for watching, folks. See you in the next one. Bye for now.